Hello? There, I'm on. Hi, I'd like to welcome all of you. I'm Carrie Otto. I'd like to welcome you to BioBuffs. Before we get started, I'd ask that you turn off your cell phones if you have them with you. And other than that, we're ready to go. Today we have Phil Carpenter, who is going to tell us about Bethlehem Steel. And we can still call it BioBuffs because he's going to tell us about Mr. Grace and Mr. Schwab. So, welcome, Phil. I'll let you take it from here.
Can anybody? Oh, how's that? Are we okay now? All right, great. Well, thank you all for coming. I'd like to do a little survey before we get started. How many people have heard of Andrew Carnegie? Okay. How about J.P. Morgan? All right. How about Eugene Grace or Charles Schwab? Oh, really? Now, I'm impressed. I want to make sure you understand we're talking about the right Schwab. We're going to be talking about that handsome gentleman on the left, not the guy that may have some of your money. So the other thing I looked at, when I came up with the title for this, just what exactly is a magnet? And so, Webster says a person of rank, power, influence, or distinction, often in a specified area. Certainly, both these gentlemen we're going to be talking about have all those traits. Maybe not all on the good side of those traits, though. So there was actually a significant overlap in the time that Charlie Schwab and Eugene Grace spent at Bethlehem Steel. Actually, Eugene Grace was already at what was known Bethlehem Iron when Charles Schwab arrived. However, you're actually going to get a little bit of a 3-4 here. We're first going to talk about Charles Schwab, and we'll talk about Eugene Grace, and together I think you're going to get a picture of what Bethlehem Steel and the impact it had during the first part of the 20th century. So where did Charles start? He was born in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. He was raised in Loretto, both of those towns, and you'll see on a map, bracket Altoona, Pennsylvania. And he briefly attended what was known then as St. Francis College. His parents were both, they're immigrants, both his parents and grandparents. And so he knew he was going to have to live by his wits. And he actually started working at a very young age. And at the age of 17, actually with the permission of his parents, he moved to Braddock, Pennsylvania, very close to Pittsburgh and actually a steel town. And he initially went to work as a clerk in a haberdashery. And you can see that he's a fairly good-looking guy, and through his charm, wit, and good looks, he kind of ingratiated himself to people. And he kind of caught the eye of a superintendent at the local Carnegie steel plant. And so he was actually hired to work in the steel plant. He actually moved up through the ranks rather quickly, and before long, he actually caught the eye of the owner of the company, Carnegie himself. And fortunately for Charles Schwab, Carnegie didn't base, who he's going to hire based on wealth, family connections, and fortunately, education. He was just interested in people who could produce steel at the lowest cost. And early in his career at Carnegie, Charles did get married, although they did have no children. Most of the people I've met here are either from the Midwest or Northwest. So maybe I put up a picture of Pennsylvania. You can see where Williamsburg, where he was born, Loretto, Braddock, and then where the bulk of the story takes place, Bethlehem, all the way on the East Coast. When Charles started Carnegie, he really didn't know anything about the steel business. So he had to master that, understanding how steel was made. But also, Carnegie had a certain way of doing things. He believed he had to control everything. He wanted efficiencies, whether in accounting or manufacturing. And he also was very much believed in the integrated steel plant. And what we mean by that, he wanted to control everything from the mining of the ore to the actual selling of the product and everything in between. He was also a very strong believer in paying people who can better make steel. So he believed in bonuses and promotions for people that could do that. And Charles, at a fairly early point, proved that he could do that. He was in charge of a mill, and all of a sudden they're producing a lot of seconds, substandard rails that couldn't really be used to their full benefit. So he started paying them people $20 who produced the best rails. And pretty soon, the quality went up, profit went up, even though he was paying them 20 extra dollars. Whoop, I jumped ahead too fast there. So he kept rising through the ranks at Carnegie, and eventually what happened was Carnegie, when he retired, he sold the company to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan then took Carnegie Steel, merged it with several other companies to produce U.S. Steel. Now, Charles Schwab's time at U.S. Steel really didn't last that long for a couple reasons. One, J.P. Morgan was the opposite of Carnegie. He didn't believe in cost cutting, efficiencies. He just said, we're just going to do it the way we have been doing it. Secondly, what happened to Schwab, he was a great person, but unfortunately, he lived a very lavish lifestyle. And he kept that under control while he's working for Carnegie, because Carnegie, being the old Scotsman that he was, didn't like living above your means, womanizing or gambling. And unfortunately, Charlie Schwab engaged in all three of those things, including getting one of his nurses pregnant out of wedlock, which Mrs. Schwab didn't take very kindly to. An example of his extravagance is a chateau that he built in New York City. It took up an entire city block between 73rd and 74th on Riverside Drive. Came with a bowling alley, swimming pool, wine cellar, 6 elevators, and of course, a poker room where he could engage in one of his favorite pastimes, high stakes poker. His lifestyle eventually got him in trouble. And what happened was he actually went to Europe to recover. He relinquished his presidency of U.S. Steel and had to recover. But being Charles Schwab, he had made investments while he was working at U.S. Steel. And one of those investments was Bethlehem Iron. He owned all of Bethlehem Iron. So he then became president of what was known as Bethlehem Iron at that time. Now, you think some people might be embarrassed by, I used to run U.S. Steel, now I'm running little Bethlehem Steel. But not Charlie, He had that kind of an ego and positive sense that he says, I'm going to make a go with this. So when Charlie got there, Bethlehem Iron was primarily a producer of iron rails and armor plate, beginning by providing rails to the Lehigh Valley Railroad at the time. And when it came upon some financial difficulties, they switched to armor plates and munitions, through some government contracts. They had actually made a reputation for making quality steel, but not being very efficient. They had brought in Frederick Taylor, a noted scientist at that time, management scientist at that time, to kind of look things over. And one of the things he suggested was, well, why don't you cut back on the number of men that you have handling raw materials? You really don't need that many. And they said, well, no, we can't do that. And the reason they couldn't was because they owned all the homes on the south side of Bethlehem where these men lived. And if they put them out of work, guess what happened to that rent income? Gone. So Charles, he fired them all. He says, I'm just going to pick 15 guys from the plant, and I'm going to make a go of it with these guys. And one of them was Eugene. Once Charles had control of the company, he did several things. He wanted to make sure that the company can grow and actually compete with U.S. Steel. So one of the things he did first off, he changed from Bessemer furnaces to the open hearth furnace to produce steel. It produced a better quality steel. He used iron ore from his mines in Cuba that had much higher iron content and lower impurities. And thus they just produced a better quality of rail. The other thing he did was, like Carnegie, he believed in incentives and promotions for those, and he included for both his hourly workers and managers. And the one thing Charles was, he was a great motivator. He was on the open hearth floor one day, and he says, to the foreman, how come you're only producing this many number of heats? And the foreman said, well, I've tried everything. I just can't get them to produce more. So at the end of the shift, he asked one of the laborers, well, how many heats did you produce today? And he said, well, we produced 6. He says, do you have a piece of chalk? And he took the chalk and he wrote a big 6 on the floor of the hearth. And the night shift comes in and they ask, well, what's that 6 all about? Well, the big boss was in today. He wanted to know how many heats we produced. And we told him 6. Okay. Well, the next morning, the day shift comes in, 6 is crossed off, and a 7 is written on the floor. You can see what's going to happen next. The competition started, and productivity went up. But Charles Schwab's biggest contribution probably was in the introduction of the rolled H-beam. There was this inventor, Henry Gray from England, who invented a way to take hot ingots, put into a rolling mill, and roll directly long lengths of H-beams. Nobody else wanted to do it. And Charles said, you know what? I believe in this. I'm going to invest my own money. And he redesigned the plant and put in the mill. And sure enough, they started rolling H-beams and soon had the largest share in the market because they could way outcompete the old types of beams that had to be riveted together. So under Schwab's leadership over the next 10 years, largely due to the H-beam, which then of course became the I-beam as we know it today, their labor force doubled every 5 years. They became the largest steel plant, never quite caught U.S. Steel, but they were largest by far. Brought in the dawn of the skyscraper era. And Schwab, although he had an affection for the hourly worker, he just did not believe in labor unions. And, and in his tenure there, labor unions never made inroads. So we're getting that period with the start of World War I. And early in the war, Schwab actually went to Europe, see if he can drum up some business for munitions and armor plating and so forth. And he secured quite a few contracts. And quickly the plant in Bethlehem became the largest producer of ordnance and munitions for the Allies. It became a very profitable time for the steel company. Excuse me. When the U.S. finally entered the war, victory was uncertain. More ships were needed to ship troops and munitions, and for various reasons, it just wasn't happening. So in April, President Wilson actually asked Charles Schwab if he would become what was known then as the Emergency Fleet Corporation. He was going to be in charge of all shipbuilding in the United States. It didn't take him long to notice that there was a lot of laziness going on, inconsistencies, inefficiencies, and so he immediately changed things from they were really running on a cost-plus basis which really isn't an incentive for produce, and he changed everything to fixed price. And he would actually pay bonuses out of his own pockets to the shipbuilders that met or exceeded their quotas. And soon enough, 6 short months, the ships would be delivered on time and sometimes even early. However, after the war, Charlie went back to his old ways. He built a 44-room mansion in his hometown of Loretto, PA. It's called Immergrün. It was picturesque with gardens. It had a 9-hole golf course designed by Donald Ross. He continued to live his lavish lifestyle. He would always participate in high-stakes gambling. He actually became a celebrity when he broke the bank in Monte Carlo, then went out and purchased a $100,000 rail car to kind of travel around in. Fortunately, he also was a philanthropist and donated a fair amount of his money to the arts. By 1922, Schwab had actually turned over most of the running of the company to Eugene Grace, and we'll see that story in a bit. He continued to be the public face of the company. I mean, that's what he liked to do. He liked to stand in front of crowds, talk to them, schmooze, and actually an elderly statesman for the steel industry. But the crash of '29 and the Depression depleted what few resources he had left. And Riverside was seized. He couldn't pay the taxes. He ended up living in a small apartment. And when he died in 1939, his Bethlehem Steel stock was worthless, and he was actually $300,000 in debt. And the sad thing is, if he had lived just a few more years, his Bethlehem Steel stock would have started coming back because Bethlehem Steel did real well during the Second World War. So if Schwab was the visionary that created Bethlehem Steel, then it was Grace, who oversaw really the tremendous growth through his prowess for production and organization, as well as he made a lot of key acquisitions to grow the company that way. Schwab was born in Cape May, New Jersey. He's the son of a ship captain who actually ran a general store, and that's where Eugene worked. His father was a very tough taskmaster, and actually may have contributed to Grace's approach to life in his later years. By the time he was in high school, he knew two things. He had to work hard, and he had a real passion for baseball, and he was also very good at it. He received a scholarship to Lehigh University in Bethlehem. He excelled both at academics and baseball. He was at the top of his class, graduating valedictorian with a degree in electrical engineering. So he was a pretty smart engineer. So his skill at baseball actually led to two opportunities. One, he actually got offered a contract to play professional baseball, but at the beginning of the 20th century, professional baseball was probably not where he wanted to be. Also, because he got noticed by his superintendent at the steel mill when Lehigh beat their arch rival Lafayette in the baseball game, this guy approached him and said, "How would you like a job at the steel mill?" And that's what Eugene Grace decided he'd do. So he hired on as a operator of electric crane for the grand sum of $1.80 a day. I'm not sure you need an engineering degree to run a crane, but I don't know. So Grace moved up through the ranks, and when Schwab took over, as we learned before, he became one of the group that he was going to put to help run the company into the future. And after Schwab sent Grace to Cuba, he had some issues with the mines down there and proved himself by working those out. Then he really started moving up through the ranks. In 1906, he was a general superintendent. 11, he was a vice president. And in 1916, he was named president of the company. And that's a role he held until he retired over 40 years later in 1957. So, as we've learned, by 22, Schwab has intentionally turned over the running of the company to Grace. Like Schwab, Grace had an extravagant lifestyle, although not as notorious. He built a mansion on Prospect Avenue, known at the time as Bonus Hill, because many of the steel execs, that's how they'd use their bonus money, building mansions on Prospect Hill. Just turns out that Grace's was the largest. That wasn't his only home, though. He also had a house in Southampton, Long Island, a suite in the Plaza Hotel in New York, as well, because he loved golf so much, a house in Aiken, South Carolina. So, unlike Schwab, Grace's passion was golf. Fortunately for him, not gambling or women. And if you were lucky enough at some of his grandiose parties, you could run into even Bing Crosby or Fred Astaire or even Bobby Jones, all of whom he had played golf with. He was also a key founder of the Saucon Valley Country Club, which is located south of Bethlehem. It's hosted U.S. Women's Open, 3 U.S. Senior Opens, and a lot of other amateur events. And actually, one of the 3 18-hole courses is named the Grace Course. The site appearances, though, Grace was not a social butterfly. He was always interested in how do we get more production? How do we produce more steel? Another difference between Schwab and Grace was their attitude towards the average steel worker. Schwab had a soft part, often knew some of their children's names, would hand out cigars. Whereas Grace, on the other hand, he just looked at the average steel worker as somebody to be told what to do, and, you just produce the steel, I'll tell you how. And Grace didn't care whether he was liked or not either. So the pre-Depression years were very good for Bethlehem Steel. They were producing steel like crazy, continuing to build the New York City skyline. There's been estimates that over 80% of the steel for the New York City skyline at that time was produced by Bethlehem Steel. But then came the crash of '29 and the Depression. They had to cut back production to 3 days a week. Grace, however, wisely continued to maintain and improve equipment, and also saw this as a good period for acquisitions. And by acquiring 10 additional plants around the country, he significantly grew the steel capacity of the company. With Roosevelt's New Deal, after the Depression, production once again picked up, and so new projects were undertaken. And one of the biggest was the Golden Gate Bridge out in San Francisco. To give you a little insight into Eugene Grace's character, he was out there looking at construction one day, and he's standing next to a foreman and says how proud he was that this was a Bethlehem Steel project. And the foreman says, well, no, sir. This is a McClintock Marshall project. Yeah, you can see all the signs saying so. Well, Bethlehem Steel owned McClintock Marshall, and the next day had their name changed to Bethlehem Fabricated Steel Construction, and all the signs changed. By the late 30s, war clouds were rising in Europe, and Grace started gearing up the company to produce for the war materials. In '39, when war was actually declared in Europe, he was quoted as saying to one of his golf foursomes, "We're about to make some money." And he was right. By the time the U.S. entered the war, Bethlehem already had $1.3 billion in orders for ammunition, ships, and bomb casings. Grace devoted the entire company's capacity to producing war materials. During the war, Bethlehem actually became the world's largest producer of ships. They produced over 1,100 ships during the period for the war. And at one time, the Sparrows Point plant, during a one-year period, was launching a ship a day, which I just find mind-boggling. After the war, Grace transitioned the company back to peacetime production, more bridges, more skyscrapers, and he initiated the plans for what was to become the last integrated steel mill built in the United States. And it was located in Burns Harbor, Michigan, on the Indiana, rather, on the shores of Lake Michigan. So there were two sides to Grace. There was the generous philanthropist who had donated generously to Lehigh University and the city of Bethlehem. But he was also a man who instilled fear, both in his hourly workers and his salaried workers. Some considered him very aloof. There was a story about how he used to arrive at the plant. The plant patrol would be on lookout for his limousine, and when they saw it drive up, they'd call the front desk in the office building and have them bring all the elevators down to the first floor, made sure they were empty, so by the time Grace walked in, he could just choose which elevator he wanted and ride in solitude up to his office on the top floor. However, storm clouds were arising. His way of producing steel, which had been the way all along, the integrated steel mill, that was the only way, even though inroads were starting to be made in imports and making steel from scrap metal. He had also created a very rigid inbred organization. There were no outside members on the board of directors. They were all steel executives, which would be unheard of in this day and age. In the late 1950s, 6 of the top 10 highest paid executives, including Schwab, in the United States, worked for Bethlehem Steel. So Grace continued to lead the company until his retirement in 1957, a period of over 40 years. However, as was his style, Grace had not groomed or named a successor. And this created a vacuum at the company, which did take some time to overcome. He died 3 years later after his retirement and was laid to rest in Niskey Hill Cemetery, overlooking the Lehigh River onto the steel plant. So if you look back, here you had 2 men who created the largest steel company in America, but clearly with 2 different styles and personalities. You had Schwab on the one hand, who was gregarious, charming, minimal formal education, but always a positive attitude, always in believing he could succeed. However, ultimately brought down by his extravagant lifestyle. And then on the other hand, you have Grace, extremely intelligent, formally educated at a prestigious university, exceptional at organizational and planning, but very rigid and aloof, resistant to change and any kind of outside influence. Actually, many believe that this was the initial step in the company's downward spiral over the years. So one of the things I also wondered is, what happened to all these mansions these guys built? Well, Riverside, New York, tried to sell it. They actually tried to give it to the city of New York for a mayor's resident, but the city wisely said, that might be too over the top for the mayor. So it was eventually torn down, made into apartment buildings, but they do actually refer to it as the Schwab House today. His estate in Loretta, that was taken over by the Friars, who run the University of San Francisco, so they now are housed there. And then Grace's mansion in Bethlehem was bought by the Archdiocese of Allentown and created into elderly living and healthcare services for the people of the Lehigh Valley. So, can I answer any questions? I believe they were primarily the Liberty ships, and then they were very much standardized. And Bethlehem wasn't the only ones producing Liberty ships, because they built. What's that? Well, yeah. There were stories of them breaking apart, actually, some of the earlier ones. Fortunately, he wasn't on one of those.
I grew up very close to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in Hazleton, which is a coal mining town about 100 miles north. And even more so, I had a brother-in-law that worked for Bethlehem Steel, so maybe I could give you a few interesting footnotes on all of this. Bethlehem Steel was a giant. I mean, they employed so many people from the whole eastern Pennsylvania area. And what really killed them was imported steel. And when they went down very, very hard. And the plant in Bethlehem, of course, got closed. My brother-in-law was transferred to another plant near Gary, Indiana. I don't know exactly the name of the town it was in there, but what happened to the old plant? That's the interesting thing. Well, most big cities, and Bethlehem isn't really a big city, but it's pretty good sized, would have torn it down, and you would have seen apartments there and all this. They didn't. They preserved it, and you can still see today the blast furnaces and everything, and they turned it into a pretty successful enterprise as far as stores. I think they brought a gambling casino in and everything.
There's a gambling casino there. That was one of the first things to go in. They built a hotel. And then Music Fest was a huge outdoor, probably one of the largest ones now. I think it actually got too big myself. I enjoyed it when it was much smaller. Mm-hmm. My wife and I, we lived in Bethlehem for over 40 years. Okay. And so now Music Fest uses that, quite a few venues down there. Mm-hmm. Actually, a good friend of ours, their daughter got married down there, and did a very nice job.
But if you want to see what the original plant looks like, you can still see the ghost of the plant there. I mean, as I say, they didn't tear it all down, and it turned out to be a successful enterprise.
Well, it's actually part of the historic museum area now.
That's right.
Almost affiliated with the National Museum in Washington. Any other questions?
I'm retired from Bethlehem Steel. I spent 30 years working for them, most all of it in the Portland, Oregon sales office. And it was, I've been retired now for 38 years, of course, so quite a change. But anyway, they were very good to work for. I was what was called a salaried employee, but we always got the same benefits that the steel workers got, which was pretty nice at that time. Anyway, I saw some of the changes that came in, like after the Second World War, and all the Japanese steel was coming into the West Coast, and East Coast people, they didn't realize this at the time. It took them a while before they realized all that steel was coming in. But anyway, I had a good 30 years there.
I'm happy for that.
Any other questions? Yep.
Do I need to turn this notes on? I was born and raised in Blue Island, Illinois, which is 30 miles west of Gary, Indiana. and you could see the light in the sky and hear the drop forges during the night. During the daytime, the traffic noise would overwhelm it, but at night, we could hear them. Boom, boom, boom. Nostalgic to see that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
What an interesting story, and it's affected so many lives. Thank you, Phil. Thank
All
you
right.
very,
Thank you all
very
for
much.
coming.
It's wonderful, the diversity that we have. We have so many different subjects. We've got one coming up next week, which is a My Life, My Story. Barbara Puddle is going to tell us about her funny adventures along the way. So be sure and come back for that one. Thank you again to our tech team. We couldn't do it without you, and we hope to see you all next week. Thank you.